Alright, so this next chapter we're talking about is chapter 10, maintaining Windows. Okay, like you see in the documentation online, we will be kind of jumping around this semester because the textbook you're using is split between our operating system class and our hardware class. So we will be going out of line. So it becomes crucial when you start looking at homework. Okay, so make sure you're paying attention from that point. Okay, so this first part of this chapter is going to be dealing with preventative maintenance and some of the utilities you would use to do that. And what preventative maintenance does is it essentially makes it easier to keep your computer running efficiently. Okay, so one of the first things that you need to do when you get your computer is you get it running, or you get it set up exactly how you want it. Okay, put your software on it, get your device drivers, everything loaded like we talked about last chapter, and then you will go on and perform what's known as a baseline. Okay, a baseline will basically let us know how the computer should be performing to be optimal. Okay, that way 6 months or a year or 2 years down the road, when you see that your performance has dropped off, you can revert back to that baseline and see what might be the issue. Okay, but one of the ways to prevent this from occurring is to perform this preventative maintenance. Okay, so this is something you can do like once a quarter, at least twice a year, to make sure that your computer runs as optimally as possible. Okay, so some of the tasks that are included are looking at the Windows settings, updating device drivers and firmware, patch management, cleaning up the drive, checking the drive for errors, and moving or manipulating your virtual memory paging file. Okay, so let's look at each one of these. Okay, first, the critical Windows settings. This is something you really need to stress to users. Okay, are these 3 different settings that are crucial within Windows. One is Windows updates. Okay, make sure that they're set to update automatically. That way your computer is guaranteed to stay as updated as possible. Okay, then your antivirus and anti-malware software. Again, make sure this is not only set to scan regularly, but also update regularly as well. Okay, viruses and malware are coming out literally, dozens to hundreds every few hours, so you need to make sure and keep that updated. And then finally, network security settings, and this is something we talked about in chapter 7, where you've got the difference between a public network, a home network, or a work network. If you choose the wrong network setting, it's going to affect your firewall settings, which could open your computer up to hackers or up to malicious software getting in. So you've got to be careful on how you set that network setting. Okay, now looking at drivers and firmware, you want to update your drivers. Not only whenever you start seeing issues, but if you start seeing your system lag in some way. Okay, it may mean that the video driver you have may not be the current version or something like that. Okay, not only that, but some pieces of hardware have what's known as firmware. Okay, this will basically be software that is actually loaded onto the controller card. Okay, so you'll need to update this periodically, just like you would a device driver. Okay, and this is referred to as flashing. Okay, you're going to flash the firmware. And it sounds a little bit more drastic than it really is. Essentially, it's the same thing, like I mentioned, as updating a device driver. So to do that, you download the flash image from the manufacturer's site. Okay, you click Browse to locate the file. You basically double-click or open up the file. Okay, this is an example of one right here. This is a RAID controller. Okay, so you're doing a flashing the image or flashing the firmware on this RAID controller. Okay, you can see here all you would have to do is browse to that location and then click Program Flash, and it's going to automatically update that for you. Again, pretty straightforward. This can be done with the BIOS or the UEFI as well. General rule of thumb, though, just to kind of give you a heads up, as far as your BIOS is concerned, you generally don't want to update that unless for 2 reasons, basically. One, if you're having issues with the computer and you think that might resolve it. Or 2, it adds functionality to your system. For instance, if you need to install an update or flash the firmware on the BIOS to add, the capability of virtual computing, then yes, that would be worth it. But otherwise, it's kind of falls back on that whole mantra of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Okay, so the next thing is patch management. Okay, so when you're going through looking and having, as an administrator or a technician, having to look through some logs or error messages, you need to be aware of some of the messages that might pop up. The term x86 is referring to 32-bit machines, 32-bit operating systems and CPUs. Okay, pretty much all the CPUs installed on computers today are going to be known as hybrid, meaning they can run both 32-bit and 64-bit operating systems. Okay, so with that, you may have an x86-x64 or something like that. Okay, and then we have the term IA64, which is going to be a very specific 64-bit Intel processor, and then the term x64, which is for 64-bit CPUs and OSs. Okay. Then another thing to look at with preventative maintenance is cleaning up the hard drive. Okay, Windows requires about 15% of hard drive space. Okay, again, the good news here is that hard drive space has become much cheaper, so it's generally not a problem. But if you're running an older PC or if you've got a hard drive with a bunch of personal data on it, you may find yourself having to delete stuff or find space on your drive. Okay, so there's a couple different ways to do this. You can either defragment the disk, check for errors, compress folders, or move files and folders to different locations. Okay, so those are all means of doing that. Okay, so first we'll look at, of course, the most effective way to free up space is to actually go through and delete information. Okay, so the first place you might want to look is going to be your user folder. Okay, so if you're dealing with Windows 7, this is real simple. It's under C, Users. Now, Windows XP had an older or a different version. Okay, so Windows XP, everything was at C, Documents and Settings, and then username, and then like My Documents, for instance. Okay, so that's under Windows XP. Now, like we saw just a second ago, Windows 7, they've changed it to where it's C, User, Username, and then Documents. They got rid of the My part as well. But it's a little bit easier to get to and everything like that. Okay, so that's a big difference between XP and 7. Okay, 7, 8, and 10 all use this format here. So that's something you really need to keep in mind. Okay. So user folder is going to be under C, Users, and then either Documents, Pictures, whatever the case may be. Okay, this is known as the user profile namespace. Okay, within that you have a file called the ntuser.dat file. Okay, this is basically going to be the file that saves all of your user profile preferences. Okay, so like your desktop settings, your folder list, views, all that kind of stuff will be saved under your ntuser.dat file. Okay, so that's something that you definitely want to keep intact. You don't want to mess with. Okay, in addition to the user profile namespace, we also have the program files. Okay, there's actually two different versions of program files on 64-bit machines. Okay, you have C program files, which is going to be for all the 64-bit programs that are installed within Windows. And then for the other versions that are 32-bit that are running on the machine, those are going to be located under C program files x86. Okay, so you'll be able to see the difference between these. Just to give you an example, here's mine on this computer. So program files, these are going to be all the 64-bit programs that are on my machine, and then x86, all the 32-bit. You see there's still quite a few pieces of software that are running off of 32-bit. Okay, so luckily Windows 7, Windows 8 has the capability to translate those to run as well. Okay, but that doesn't mean that those device drivers can be 32-bit. Remember, those have to be 64 because those specifically deal with how the devices communicate with Windows. Okay, and then a couple important locations just to be aware of. Your registry, okay, which we'll talk about that a little bit more, but basically this is going to be like a database that keeps all of your settings and stuff like that in place within Windows. That's going to be under C, Windows, System32, and Config. Okay, that's this right here. And then we have the backup of the registry, which is under C, Windows, System32, Config, Reg Backup. Okay, makes sense, right? Okay, and then you have the fonts under C, Windows, Fonts. Temporary files under C, Windows, Temp. This is a great location right here to go through and clean out periodically. Okay, because just the whole definition of temp means that we don't need that stuff long term, so we can go through and clean that out as we see fit. Offline files are going to be under C, Windows, CSC, or client-side caching. Okay, this was popular back in dial-up days. Okay, if you had the wonderful joy of dealing with dial-up, then basically what you would do is you would go in and select websites to be available offline. So what that means is when your dial-up connection got severed or whenever you were traveling and you didn't have internet, you could still view that web page, but it would just be the offline version. Okay, so nowadays with everything available through Wi-Fi and everything like that, that's really not a problem we have to worry about.